From the trial records of the Prince Bishopric Court of Würzburg, Spring Session 1704, the testimony of Maria Renata Singer. I confess that in my hour of greatest need, when my husband's debts would have seen us cast in the street, a small man appeared to me. He was no taller than a child of 8 years, but his eyes were ancient. He offered me a solution, gold enough to satisfy our creditors. When I asked what payment he required, he said only, "Promise me what you do not yet possess." In my desperation, I agreed. I did not understand until my child was born that I had promised him my son. Maria Renata Singer was convicted of making a demonic pact. She was executed by burning on the 12th of May, 1704. The small man was never found. Her infant son disappeared 3 days after her arrest and was never recovered. But what if I told you that Maria's case wasn't unique? That across Europe, for centuries, there existed a pattern, a series of encounters between desperate people and mysterious brokers who appeared when economic ruin seemed inevitable, offering salvation at a price that wouldn't come due until years later. What if I told you that one of these cases became so notorious, so widely whispered about in villages and courts, that it transformed into something else entirely? A story we now tell children at bedtime. I'm Danielle Christmas, and this is Folklore Forensics, where myth meets true crime. Today's case begins with a lie, a father's desperate boast to save his own reputation. It escalates into coercion, contract fraud, and ultimately, attempted child abduction. The perpetrator operated across multiple kingdoms, targeting young women in crisis, exploiting their vulnerability with contracts they couldn't possibly fulfill. His methods were consistent. His demands escalated. And for years, no one knew his real name. This is case file number 131, the Rumpelstiltskin child contract. Listener discretion is advised. Every crime has an origin point, a moment when circumstances align, when choices are made, when the machinery of tragedy begins to turn. In this case, that moment occurs not in a dark alley or a locked room, but in the corridor of a palace during what should have been an ordinary day. The year is difficult to pinpoint with precision. The records that survive are fragmentary, encoded in oral testimony passed down through generations. But we can place it somewhere in the late medieval period, in a small kingdom in what we now call Central Europe. The economy is feudal, the social hierarchy is rigid, and a miller, a man of modest means who grinds grain for the local community, finds himself in the presence of the king. We don't know exactly how this audience came about. Perhaps the king was touring his lands, perhaps the miller was summoned for some administrative matter, taxes, grain quotas, the mundane business of medieval governance. What we do know is this: the miller, faced with royalty, felt the crushing weight of his own insignificance. And so he lied. The lie was specific, audacious, the kind of fabrication that reveals both desperation and a fundamental misunderstanding of power. The miller told the king that his daughter, a young woman whose name has been lost to history, though some accounts call her Alara or Margit, possessed an extraordinary ability. She could spin straw into gold. Now let's pause here and consider the psychology of this moment. Why would a father make such a claim? What was he hoping to achieve? In the feudal economy, a miller occupied an interesting position. He was essential, communities needed grain processed, but he was also vulnerable. Millers were often suspected of cheating, of keeping more than their share of flour. They were middlemen, and middlemen are rarely trusted. The miller, in this moment, may have been trying to elevate his status to make himself memorable, important. to transform his daughter from a peasant girl into someone remarkable. Or perhaps he was simply trying to deflect attention from his own failures. Perhaps the king had been questioning him about shortfalls, about productivity. Perhaps the lie was a desperate redirect. Don't look at me, look at what my daughter can do. Whatever his motivation, the consequence was immediate and catastrophic. When the miller was later questioned by the crown's magistrate, this interrogation recorded by royal scribe Heinrich von Sachs on the 17th of October, his desperation became painfully clear. He admitted that 3 years of poor harvests had left him drowning in debt, 17 marks of silver owed to the crown with no way to pay. When the magistrate pressed him on why he'd made such an outrageous claim, the miller's answer was almost pitiable. He thought that if the king believed his house possessed value, perhaps the debt might be forgiven, perhaps his daughter might be spared. He hadn't thought the king would actually take her. The scribe noted that the miller wept during his testimony. His confession was deemed insufficient to spare his daughter from the royal test. The king, and here we must understand the medieval royal mindset, did not hear this claim as a metaphor or a boast. He heard it as a resource. Gold was the foundation of power. Wars were funded with gold. Alliances were purchased with gold. If this girl could truly transmute straw into gold, she was not a person. She was a mint, a renewable source of wealth. The king's response was swift. He ordered the girl brought to the palace immediately. Imagine receiving this news. You're a young woman, probably in your late teens or early 20s. You live in a mill. Your days are spent helping your father with his work, perhaps spinning wool or flax in the evenings, actual spinning, the kind that produces thread, not gold. Your life is small, predictable, safe within its limitations. And then soldiers arrive. They tell you the king has summoned you. They tell you your father has made a claim about your abilities. They don't tell you what will happen if that claim proves false. But you can guess. The penalty for deceiving the king, for wasting royal time, for making a mockery of royal authority. In this period, in this place, it would almost certainly be death. The girl, let's call her by one of the names that survived in the oral tradition, Margit, was taken to the palace. She was brought before the king, and the king explained the test. She would be locked in a room. The room would be filled with straw. She would be given a spinning wheel. By morning, all the straw must be transformed into gold. If she succeeded, she would be rewarded. If she failed, she would be executed. And this is where our case truly begins. Because what happens next in that locked room, what transpires between sunset and sunrise, is the crime at the heart of this investigation. The room was in one of the palace's lower chambers. Stone walls, a single high window. The door was heavy oak, and when it closed behind Margit, she heard the bolt slide into place from the outside. The straw was piled everywhere, bales of it, loose sheaves of it, the dry golden stalks that were worthless except as animal bedding or roof thatching. And in the center of the room, a spinning wheel. Margit knew how to spin. She'd been spinning thread since childhood. But straw? Straw doesn't have fibers that can be drawn out and twisted. It's hollow, brittle. You can't spin straw into anything, let alone gold. The task was impossible. And the penalty for failure was death. According to the accounts that survived, Margit did what any person would do in that situation. She sat down on the floor, surrounded by straw, and she wept. This is the moment when he appeared. The descriptions are remarkably consistent across different versions of this story. A small man, some accounts say he was no taller than a child. Others describe him as wizened, ancient, though his movements were quick and energetic. He wore unusual clothing. Some testimonies mention a pointed hat, others a long coat that seemed too fine for someone of his stature. His voice was high, almost musical, and his eyes, multiple accounts emphasize his eyes, were sharp, calculating, the eyes of someone who saw not people, but opportunities. He appeared suddenly. The door hadn't opened. He was simply there, as if he'd materialized from the shadows themselves. His first words were a question. "What will you give me if I spin this straw into gold for you?" Let's examine this moment from an investigative perspective. This is the initial contact between perpetrator and victim, and it follows a pattern we see in many coercive crimes. First, he appears when the victim is at her most vulnerable. Margit is alone, terrified, facing imminent death. She has no resources, no options, no power. Second, he immediately frames the interaction as a transaction. Not, "Can I help you?" but "What will you give me?" He establishes from the first moment that his assistance has a price. Third, he demonstrates knowledge of her situation. He knows about the straw, the gold, the impossible task. This suggests surveillance, planning. He didn't stumble upon her by accident. He was waiting for this moment. This is predatory behavior. This is someone who has done this before. Margit, desperate and terrified, looked at what she had. She was wearing a necklace, a simple thing, probably a ribbon with a small pendant. She offered it to him. He accepted. And then he sat down at the spinning wheel and began to work. The accounts describe the sound, the wheel turning faster than any human should be able to spin, a whirring that filled the room. The straw fed into the wheel, and what emerged, wound onto the bobbin, spooling out in gleaming coils, was gold thread, real gold, soft and heavy and unmistakable. By morning, the room was transformed. Where there had been straw, there was now skeins of gold thread, piled and gleaming in the early light. The small man was gone. When the king opened the door and saw the gold, his reaction was not gratitude or wonder. It was greed. If she could do this once, she could do it again, and again, and again. That night, Margit was locked in a larger room, more straw, the same impossible demand. Margit understood now that the first night had not been a miracle, it had been a pattern, and when she began to weep, the small man appeared again. "What will you give me if I spin this straw into gold for you?" This time, Margit offered her ring, a small band, probably silver, perhaps a family heirloom. He took it, and once again, by morning, the straw had become gold. The king didn't ask how the gold was made, only how much more could be produced. The king's greed intensified. On the third night, Margit was locked in the largest room in the palace. Straw filled it from floor to ceiling, and the king made a new promise. If she could spin all of this straw into gold, he would marry her. She would become queen. But if she failed, she would die. This is where the crime escalates, because when the small man appeared for the third time and asked his question, "What will you give me?" Margit had nothing left to offer. She told him so. She had no more jewelry, no possessions, nothing of value. And this is when he made his true demand. "Then promise me your first child when you become queen." Let's be very clear about what's happening here. This is contract coercion under duress. Margit is facing execution. She has no bargaining power, no ability to negotiate, no option to refuse. The small man has engineered a situation where she must agree to his terms or die. And the terms themselves are designed to be devastating. A first child, not money, not jewels, not anything she currently possesses, something that doesn't yet exist, something she may not even believe she'll ever have. In her desperation, facing death in a matter of hours, Margit agreed. The small man spun the straw into gold. By morning, the room glittered with wealth beyond measure. The king, true to his word, married her. Margit, the miller's daughter, became queen, and the small man disappeared. For a year, there was silence. Margit settled into her new life. The impossible bargain she'd made in that locked room must have seemed like a nightmare, something that happened to a different person in a different life. She was queen now. She was safe. She was protected by the power of the crown. And then she became pregnant. The baby was born in the spring, a healthy child, a son, the heir to the kingdom. The palace celebrated, the king was jubilant, and Margit, holding her newborn son, must have felt the full weight of what she'd promised. But perhaps she hoped he wouldn't come. Perhaps she told herself it had all been a dream, a hallucination born of terror and exhaustion. Perhaps she believed that a year was long enough for him to have forgotten, or moved on, or simply ceased to exist. She was wrong. He appeared in the nursery 3 days after the birth. The same small man, unchanged, as if no time had passed at all. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He was simply there, standing beside the cradle where the infant slept. "I've come for what you promised me," he said. The accounts describe Margit's reaction in visceral detail. She fell to her knees. She begged. She offered him anything else, all the wealth of the kingdom, gold, jewels, land, titles, anything but her child. The small man was unmoved. "A living thing is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world," he said. A chilling statement, one that raises deeply disturbing questions about his real intent. But then, and this is crucial to understanding how the case resolves, he made a new offer, a modification to the contract. What's remarkable is that we have a first-hand account of this encounter. Lady Margaretha von Linden, the royal nursemaid, was present in the nursery that night. Her deposition to the Crown's magistrate, recorded on the 23rd of April, provides details that no one should have been able to invent. She describes the moment with precision. She was attending to the linens when he appeared, not entering through the door, not climbing through the window, simply there, as if materializing from the air itself. Margaretha watched as the queen fell prostrate, weeping, offering him riches beyond measure. But the creature, and note that she calls him a creature, not a man, though he wore a man's shape, spoke in a voice she described as like wind through dry leaves. His eyes, she testified, were black as pitch, no white, no iris, just absolute darkness. Margaretha's account is clinical in its horror. She was a trained observer accustomed to the details of royal life, and what she witnessed terrified her so completely that she could barely articulate it to the magistrate. "I have never known such terror," she concluded. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a trick of candlelight or exhaustion. This was a woman describing something that defied explanation. He would give her 3 days. If in that time Margit could discover his name, she could keep her child. If she failed, the child would be his. This is an interesting development from a criminal psychology perspective. Why would he offer her this chance? Why introduce this element of risk into what was, from his perspective, a completed transaction? Several theories emerge. One possibility, his arrogance. A man who'd operated across territories, who'd extracted promises from desperate women and disappeared without consequence, might believe his identity unknowable. The game itself becomes a display of confidence, a predator certain enough of his invisibility to toy with his victim. This suggests a long operational history, evasion hardened into certainty. But there's another reading. The game was the predation. He didn't want the child. He wanted to watch Margit fail. The 3 days of hope followed by inevitable loss would be torture layered on top of the contract itself. For a predator of this sophistication, the suffering was often the point. And then there's a third possibility. Perhaps there were rules, constraints we don't understand. Perhaps the contract itself contained loopholes, conditions that required escape. If so, the game wasn't mercy, it was protocol, a system with its own hidden architecture. Whatever his reasoning, Margit seized the opportunity. She had 3 days to discover the name of the man who appeared and disappeared like smoke, who left no traces, who seemed to exist outside the normal structures of society. She began an investigation. The queen sent messengers throughout the kingdom. They were instructed to compile lists of every name they encountered. Common names, unusual names, foreign names, ancient names. They went to villages and monasteries, to markets and taverns, collecting names like evidence. Margit herself spent hours with these lists, memorizing them, preparing for the confrontation. On the first night, when the small man appeared, she recited names, dozens of them. Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, Heinrich, Wilhelm, Friedrich. On and on, watching his face for any reaction. He smiled at each one. "That is not my name," he said. And he left. On the second night, she tried more unusual names from old legends, names from foreign lands. Bandy-legs, crookshanks, spindleshanks, descriptive names, the kind that might be given to someone of his appearance. Again, he smiled. "That is not my name," and he left. Margit understood then what the lists could not teach her. A name cannot be guessed from the outside. It must be discovered. It must be earned through investigation, through watching, through understanding who this man was when he believed no one was watching. Survival would not come from obedience or hope. It would come from strategy. By the third day, Margit was desperate. She'd exhausted every conventional avenue of investigation. And then one of her messengers returned with something different. Not a list of names, but a story. The messenger had been traveling through a remote forest, far from any village, when he'd seen smoke rising from a clearing. Curious, he'd approached quietly and witnessed something strange. A small man was dancing around a fire. He was alone, but he was singing, a high, gleeful song, and the words of that song were these: "Today I brew, tomorrow I bake, the next day the young queen's child I'll take. How glad I am that nobody knows that my name is Rumpelstiltskin." This account, the one that would change everything, was preserved in the official record. The messenger, a courier named Wilhelm the Red, submitted a sworn statement to the queen describing exactly what he'd witnessed. He'd been traveling northeast of the Blackthorn Crossing, deep in the old forest where no proper path runs, when he came upon that clearing with its unnatural fire. He watched for what he estimated as 2 full prayers, long enough to be certain, short enough to avoid detection. And he heard the name repeated 3 times in that gleeful song. Wilhelm was adamant about this detail. He swore upon his honor and his life that what he'd heard was unmistakable: Rumpelstiltskin. The perpetrator had celebrated his victory so completely, so certain of his safety, that he'd sung his own true name into the forest air. And that song had found its way back to the one person who needed to hear it. This is the breakthrough, the moment when the perpetrator's operational security fails. And it fails because of hubris, because he believed himself so safe, so untouchable, that he could celebrate his impending victory out loud, alone in the forest where no one should have been able to hear. But someone did hear, and that information made its way back to the queen. That night, when the small man appeared in the nursery for the final time, Margit was ready. She pretended to struggle. She offered a few incorrect names, watching him smile, letting him believe he'd won. And then, as if it were a last desperate guess, she said, "Is your name Rumpelstiltskin?" Identity was the one thing he could not bargain away. The reaction was immediate and violent. The small man shrieked, "The devil told you that! The devil told you that!" He stamped his foot so hard that it went through the floor. And then, in his rage, he grabbed his own leg and tore himself in two. Other versions of the account differ slightly. Some say he ran away and was never seen again. Some say he flew out the window on a cooking ladle. But the consistent element is this: the revelation of his name broke his power. The contract was voided. The child was safe. Rumpelstiltskin was gone. So who was Rumpelstiltskin? And more importantly, what was he? When we examine this case through a forensic lens, several disturbing patterns emerge. Patterns that suggest this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather one example of a much larger operation. First, the targeting methodology. He didn't appear to the wealthy or the powerful. He appeared to young women in crisis, women facing death, women with no power, no resources, no options. He hunted in desperation. He hunted where systems had already failed, where hope had already collapsed. This wasn't coincidence. This was selection. Second, the escalating demands. The first night, he accepted a necklace. The second night, a ring. These were tests, establishing the transactional relationship, normalizing the exchange. By the third night, when Margit had nothing left, he was positioned to demand something far more valuable. This is a classic grooming pattern, building up to the real crime. Third, the nature of the final demand. He didn't want gold or jewels or wealth. He wanted a child, a living thing, as he put it. This raises deeply disturbing questions about his ultimate purpose. Was this about power? Control? Something darker? And here's where the case files become truly chilling, because Margit wasn't alone. In 1673, in Württemberg, a woman named Anna Keller reported a bargain with a man of diminutive stature who spun flax into silver thread in exchange for her firstborn. Her child vanished at 3 months old. 16 years later in Bavaria, Elizabeth Braun testified that a small gray man transformed her father's debts into gold coin in exchange for her infant daughter, who was never recovered. In 1702 in Saxony, Greta Hoffmann was locked in a chamber facing execution when a little man appeared, offering salvation in exchange for, quote, "that which you do not yet possess." Her son disappeared within days of his birth. And in 1718, in Thuringia, Johanna Weiss's child vanished following a reported encounter with a creature no higher than a child, but ancient in countenance. 4 women, 4 different territories, 4 different decades, all describing the same figure, all losing their children to the same predator. But what if we set aside the supernatural explanation for a moment? What if we consider the possibility that these stories encode something real, not literal magic, but a social phenomenon? In medieval Europe, debt was bondage. If you couldn't pay, you could lose your freedom, your property, your children. There were systems, legal and illegal, that exploited the desperate. And there were people who specialized in these transactions, middlemen who operated in the shadows, who appeared when someone was desperate enough to agree to anything, who structured deals that seemed like salvation but were actually traps. Could Rumpelstiltskin have been one of these brokers? Someone with access to resources, perhaps stolen gold, perhaps counterfeit, who used that access to extract promises from people with no other options? His insistence on secrecy supports this. If he was operating outside the law, anonymity would be essential. His name was his vulnerability. Once known, he could be identified, tracked, held accountable. And the demand for a firstborn child? In medieval society, children were economic assets. To demand that child was to demand the victim's future itself, ensuring permanent leverage. And if he did collect, there were markets for children in this period. Orphans and foundlings sold into apprenticeships or service. A child with no legal identity would be valuable to the right buyer. This is speculation, but the pattern of behavior, the targeting, the coercion, the specific demands, suggests someone who understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerable and who had done it many times before. So what happened after that final confrontation in the nursery? What was the ultimate resolution of this case? The immediate outcome is clear. Margit kept her child, the contract was broken, Rumpelstiltskin's power was shattered by the revelation of his name, and he disappeared, whether through death, flight, or some other means the accounts don't agree. But let's consider the broader implications. Margit was now queen, with all the power and resources that position entailed. She had survived an ordeal that should have killed her multiple times over. She had been coerced into an impossible bargain and had found a way to break it. Did she pursue further investigation? Did she try to discover if there were other victims, other young women who had encountered this same mysterious figure and made similar bargains? Their surviving accounts don't tell us, but it's worth considering. If Rumpelstiltskin was part of a larger pattern, if he was one of many such brokers operating across medieval Europe, then Margit's case might have been just one of hundreds or thousands. Most of those victims wouldn't have had her resources, her eventual power, her ability to mount an investigation. Most would have simply lost their children, or their freedom, or their lives. There's a detail in some versions of this story that's particularly chilling. After Rumpelstiltskin's disappearance, Margit ordered a search of the forest where he'd been seen dancing and singing. Her men found a small cottage hidden deep in the woods. Inside, they found evidence of his operations: spinning wheels, stores of gold thread, and, according to some accounts, records, lists of names, dates, transactions. The dust was thick on the floor, threads still wound tight on the wheel. If these records existed, they would have been evidence of a serial operation. Proof that Margit's case was not unique, that Rumpelstiltskin had been doing this for years, perhaps decades. Proof of other victims, other bargains, other children promised and possibly taken. But the accounts don't tell us what happened to these records if they existed. Were they destroyed? Hidden? Used to track down other victims and offer them some form of restitution or justice? We don't know. What we do know is that this story spread. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, transformed from a specific case into a cautionary tale. And in that transformation, something important happened. This story became a warning about the dangers of desperate bargains, about the people who prey on the vulnerable, about the importance of reading the fine print, understanding the true cost of a deal that seems too good to be true. But it also became a story about resistance, about a woman who, despite having no power, despite being trapped in an impossible situation, found a way to fight back. She used intelligence, resourcefulness, and determination to break a contract that should have been unbreakable. She discovered her enemy's true name, his identity, his vulnerability, and she used that knowledge to defeat him. In a time and place where women had very little legal power, where they could be married off against their will, where their children could be taken from them by fathers or husbands or kings, this story offered something radical: the possibility of resistance, the possibility that even the most powerless person could find a way to protect what mattered most. From a modern perspective, we might ask, was justice served? Rumpelstiltskin disappeared, but we don't know if he faced any formal punishment. There was no trial, no legal accountability. He simply vanished, leaving his victims, and there were almost certainly other victims, without closure, without restitution, without the satisfaction of seeing their abuser held accountable in any systematic way. Margit survived, but at what cost? She'd been terrorized, coerced, forced into a bargain that haunted her through her pregnancy and the first days of her child's life. Even after Rumpelstiltskin was gone, those psychological scars would have remained. And the systems that enabled this crime, the economic desperation, the power imbalances, the lack of legal protections for the vulnerable, those systems continued. Other Rumpelstiltskins, other predatory brokers continued to operate. The story might have served as a warning, but warnings don't dismantle unjust systems. Still, there's something powerful in the fact that this story survived, that it was told and retold, that it crossed borders and languages, that it persisted for centuries. It survived because it spoke to something real, a pattern of exploitation that people recognized, that they'd experienced or witnessed or feared. And it survived because it offered hope, the hope that even in the darkest circumstances, even when facing an enemy who seemed to have all the power, there was a possibility of escape. All you had to do was discover the true name of the thing that haunted you. The case of the Rumpelstiltskin child contract remains in many ways open. We may never know the full extent of his operations, the complete list of his victims, the ultimate fate of the children who were promised and possibly taken. The historical record is fragmentary, encoded in stories that have been shaped and reshaped by centuries of retelling. But we know enough. We know the pattern, we know the crime, and we know that one victim, at least, found a way to fight back. Remember her. Remember that even in the darkest room, locked and alone, facing impossible odds, she found a way to survive. That concludes case file number 131, the Rumpelstiltskin child contract. But the story doesn't end there. Keep listening for a brief case epilogue on the wartime history of this infamous name. In 1937, a German chemist named Friedrich Bergius invented a coal-to-synthetic fuel process that became known informally in engineering circles as Rumpelstiltskin, the thing that could spin base material into gold. What began as chemistry would soon become machinery of war. But here's what's interesting. The name carried a warning with it, because everyone who used it knew the story. They knew that Rumpelstiltskin's gold came with a price, that the bargain was never as simple as it seemed, that there was always a cost, always a reckoning. And in the case of synthetic fuel production, that warning proved prescient. The process was used extensively by Nazi Germany during World War II, when access to natural petroleum was limited. It allowed the regime to continue its war machine, to fuel its tanks and planes and ships. The gold that Rumpelstiltskin spun, the synthetic fuel, came at an enormous cost. The labor of concentration camp prisoners, the exploitation of occupied territories, the continuation of a war that killed millions. The price, as always, was paid by the vulnerable. After the war, the name fell out of use. It was too tainted, too associated with that dark period. But the metaphor remained, embedded in the language, a reminder that transformation always has a cost, that value doesn't come from nothing, that someone, somewhere, pays the price. Decades later, the metaphor resurfaced in economics and finance, where critics used it to label policies that promised wealth from nothing. There's a reason this story has survived for centuries, crossing cultures and languages, adapting to new contexts while maintaining its essential shape. It's because the pattern it describes is real and recurring. There are always people in desperate circumstances. There are always predators who exploit that desperation. And there are bargains that look like salvation, but aren't. Ultimately, there is always a price that escalates, that comes due when you're least prepared, that threatens what you love most. But the story also tells us this: names have power. Identity has power. When you can name the thing that's exploiting you, when you can identify the system, the person, the mechanism, you have a chance to break its hold. Rumpelstiltskin's power shattered the moment his name was spoken aloud. The secret was revealed, the hidden was made visible, and in that revelation, the victim became something else. A survivor, a victor, someone who had looked into darkness and found the one word that could banish it. In our modern world, we still encounter Rumpelstiltskins. They wear different faces now, but the principle remains the same. If you can name it, if you can identify it, if you can speak its true nature aloud, you have a chance to break its power. That's the real legacy of the Rumpelstiltskin case. Not the magic, not the fairy tale, but the fundamental truth underneath. That knowledge is power, that secrets protect predators, and that sometimes the most radical act of resistance is simply to say the true name of the thing that haunts you. Next week, we reopen one final case to close our first season. One last case file drawn from myth, legend, and lore before this archive falls briefly silent. I'm Danielle Christmas, and you've been listening to Folklore Forensics. Folklore Forensics is written and hosted by me and produced by Audio Ellis. Theme music is by the Soundlings and Josh Pan. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow Folklore Forensics on Instagram at Folklore Forensics. Please send future case suggestions to folkloreforensicspod@gmail.com. Until next time, stay curious and always follow the evidence.